Thank you all for joining us here today. I'm really pleased that we have this opportunity to come together to talk, engage, learn more, and collaborate with regard to this very important subject matter. I have the privilege of leading a team of very passionate and hardworking public servants in the Ministry of Natural Resources who are committed to making this act work, and they work really hard at doing that every single day. I also have the privilege of working very closely with a lot of Aboriginal communities and stakeholders, conservation-minded organizations, industrial partners, who are also committed to making this act work. In the 5 years, I started about 2 months in this position, about 2 months before the act came into force. In the 5 years that I've been involved, I have yet to find one partner, one person who is not committed to species at risk or to try to make this act work. With that in mind, my role here today is to talk to you a little bit and give you some context about the act, and some of that will have been covered. I see many faces that I know quite well, and if some of the things that I'm covering are things that you're already aware of, my apologies, but I think what we're trying to do here is to set us all on a common ground, a common level of understanding for what the Act provides us with. With that, the Endangered Species Act, likened to an ecosystem. It has many moving parts, all of which have a specific role to play, and none of them work in isolation. All those parts culminate in achieving a common goal. There's 3 components to that common goal. One is about identifying species at risk based on the best available scientific information. You heard a little bit about that from Mr. Miller. But it also includes including information from community knowledge and Aboriginal traditional knowledge. The second one is to protect species that are at risk, as well as their habitats. I think we all know that good habitat is an important indicator of the livelihood of those species, and to promote the recovery of those species, which is at the heart of this piece of legislation. And one of the really important ones is to promote stewardship activities that assist in the protection and recovery. The reason I say that that is really important is we can't do this alone. What I mean by we, I think I'm acknowledging that we're all in this together. M&R has a role, many ministries in government have a role, other levels of government. You'll see as I move on how we all have to, whether you're in industry, a conservation-minded organization, the general public, Aboriginal communities, we all have a role to play in doing our best to implement this piece of legislation. Thought I'd give you a bit of an overview of species at risk classifications. So there are 5 classifications: extinct, extirpated, endangered, threatened, and special concern. You'll see on the slides that there's a breakdown of the various 200 or plus or so species that are on the species at risk list in Ontario. Of those, there are 34 birds and 29 fish and 15 insects, and the list goes on. But generally, what you'll see is a good cross-section of biodiversity that we all have to consider, and that we know that we have an increasing level of attention to play. Each of these classifications have a degree of increasing risk of extinction, and ultimately, as we move forward, we have to pay more attention to that increase. Who's involved? It's just a little bit of a diagram to recognize that no one agency, group, or government organization is responsible for the ESA implementation or its successes. It's a collaborative effort. And I tell you that for every 6 examples of things that aren't working, there are 12 more that are. And I'll give you some examples as I proceed through my presentation, but before I get to those, I thought I'd give you a little bit of an overview of what we're protecting. First one is a wood turtle. It's endangered in Ontario. Or the barn owl, estimated that there are only 5 breeding pairs currently existing in Ontario. It's endangered in Ontario as well. The common 5-line skink. Spontaneously, it can break off its tail to distract predators while it escapes the tail, but it'll grow back. A red-side dace, small minnow that can grow up to about 12 centimeters in length. It's also endangered in Ontario, found in pools and slow-moving streams. The eastern hognose snake that impersonates a cobra. Ooh, scary, to scare off its potential threats, but it's in fact quite harmless. It's threatened in Ontario. You heard a little bit about the butternut tree. It's endangered in Ontario. Its main threat is the butternut canker. 95% of the trees, I understand, are affected by that canker, but for some reason, about 5% are resistant or immune to that canker. We're spending some money trying to figure that out and why. Going to move to the legislative processes. The heart of this, as you heard earlier, is the science-based listing process. And it starts, hopefully everyone can see this, but it starts with an assessment by Caseiro to determine the next steps, which move into once a species has been determined to be on the species at risk list. If it's threatened or endangered, it gets automatic species protection and general habitat protection upon listing. Then we move, you heard a little bit about recovery strategies. From there, all within fairly aggressive timelines, we move to the completion of a government response, which is government's ability to decide what's important for the species, make some investments, and find that balance, if you want to call it, in terms of where it puts forward its investments. And finally, a requirement for habitat protection. So while a newly listed species gets general habitat protection, the government once again has an opportunity, when those things are complete, to define an area in regulation to support the needs of that particular species. I'm going to speak to each of those components in a little more detail. First one I'll speak to is Caseiro. So I think everyone understands that this piece of legislation has very few comparators in North America, very few in the world. But at the heart is the recognition. It's the only jurisdiction in Canada in particular that has this science-based listing process, where the independent body assesses and classifies species at risk based on their best available scientific information. Before the new ESA came into force in 2008, there were 42 species that received protection. When the ESA came into force, 96 additional species moved in to receive protection. And since that time, up until 2012, Caseiro has issued 6 reports, which have resulted in 6 changes to the species in Ontario list that included 31 additional species being added to the list, classification changes for 55 species, and 5 species being removed. So it's a very dynamic process that we work within. The next piece on that diagram is the completion of recovery strategies. As you heard earlier, recovery strategies represents the scientific basis and the foundation to inform species recovery and protection in Ontario. Before the Act came into force, there were no province-specific recovery strategies that have been finalized for species at risk in Ontario. Really proud to say that since that time, we finalized 66 of those recovery strategies, and many more are being worked on. Government response statements. Many would say that's where the rubber hits the road. It's our policy response to the scientific advice recovery strategy. And we've divided those into actions that are led by the government and actions that are supported by the government. Coming back to my point earlier, government responses are the government's ability to recognize and acknowledge the goals, the recommendations in the recovery strategy, and determine not only what's good for the species, what's doable, what's achievable, what it has the resources to support, and what it's going to rely on others to work together. As I said earlier, it's a collaborative effort. To date, we have completed 47 government responses. And by the end of this calendar year, we expect to almost double that with a total of 89 having been completed. I'm going to give you an example of a government response statement. It's one that we're particularly proud of. It's one that unfortunately I don't think we can replicate because it's very costly. And it's about the woodland caribou. So woodland caribou, for those of you that have your quarters, know a little bit about the caribou, an iconic species, about 5,000 woodland caribou left in Ontario, we estimate. Once widespread in Ontario, seen a decline of about 40% since the late 1800s. Working very closely with our partners to implement Ontario's caribou conservation plan, and we've invested millions of dollars in this particular species. And in fact, I've got a little clip here, which is a video that I'm going to ask a tech guy to help me out here. So since 2008, as part of our investment, we've installed about 15 caribou cams on caribou, and 150 GPS collars. You'll see this action. So we use these cameras to learn more about the species. You'll see here 15-second intervals, but it tells us what habitat they're using, the food they're eating, and in this case, what happens when calves are born. So you'll see here is mom cleaning a calf shortly after being born. You'll see her struggle a little bit to get up. Pause here for a second. There she is, struggles a bit. There she is. So that was just a tidbit of information that I wanted to share with you. M&R is leading nationally. I believe this is it's a most comprehensive research program in caribou that exists anywhere. We're learning a lot of things, as I said, about the food they're eating, what happens when calves are born, what habitat they're using, whether they're actually returning to previously harvested forest, and how caribou are affected by linear features like roads and power corridors. You heard a little bit earlier about some of the issues around authorizations, but I also have some good news around authorizations. So, as was noted, there are two key prohibitions in the Endangered Species Act. First is one related to species protection, that you can't harm, harass, or kill an endangered, threatened, or extirpated species. And the second is you can't damage or destroy the habitat of that endangered or threatened species. The Act allows authorizations to these contraventions prior and requires certain conditions to be met. And there are a number of ways to do that, permits, agreements, or the use of other instruments like regulations that allow activities to occur. I had the pleasure last night here at the ROM in the theater to join a few colleagues, Tom, and I see Dr. Ann Bell here, and Dave Ireland from the ROM to speak to a group of ROM members about the Act as a precursor to this event. And in particular, it was quite interesting because there were three young ladies who joined the group who were students and happened to be here wandering through the day. And I think David ran into them and told them about the event. So they joined, and one of the girls came up and said, well, I don't get it. Like, if these are such imperiled species, why are you authorizing things to harm them? And I think that's a really good question, and one that was very insightful from a girl of her age. I suspect she was about 12, I don't know, probably in grade 6 or 7 or something like that. Very insightful question. And the fact remains is there are very many reasons why we authorize activities to occur that would contravene the Act. Sometimes it's to allow the scientific community to do things so that we gain a better understanding of what the species needs are. And sometimes those things have a detrimental impact. We impose conditions and make sure that they follow the rules. But we also issue authorizations for activities to occur to support Ontarians' needs. An example of that is a renewable energy project near Ottawa that impacted 27 hectares of bobolink. You heard about bobolink. You know that one of its biggest considerations of the adequacy and availability of habitat, especially in the spring and the summer. Through our authorizations, we managed to establish that provider would manage 37 acres or hectares of area adjacent to that site. And so what we're doing is replacing 27 with 37 and ensuring that it gets managed in the long term for the needs of those species. Give you another example of an authorization, wood turtle. So an aggregate pit operation in wood turtle habitat was allowed to proceed, provided they met certain timing windows were adhered to. So most of these authorizations first start by avoidance. So what we're looking to do is to engage individuals to make sure that they avoid the interaction or the contravention of the Act. But if they can't, we can work closely with them. And in some cases, we might be able to spell out those rules and regulations so that there's an avoidance of a permit, and that's part of the proposal that our ESA panel has put forward. I'll speak to you that in a few minutes. But required to install silt fencing and rehabilitation of the site to actually make it better for those turtles. We've also had some innovations in authorizations, and I think some high praise for some communities who are taking these things seriously. So you've heard about the term overall benefit, which essentially requires that you make it better for the species that you're impacting than if the activity had not occurred. We issued an overall benefit permit for a subdivision development that would impact Jefferson salamander, and we worked with the local municipality to implement temporary road closures during the migratory period, things that would have never occurred before this piece of legislation. So we're working really closely with our partners to make this act work. Another innovation, chimney swift. Chimney swift is a migratory bird that naturally, guess where it nests? In chimneys. Many suitable chimneys are typically found in older buildings. A lot of them have been capped, so they can't be used anymore, but some of them haven't. Sometimes those chimneys need to be repaired, sometimes they need to be taken down. In this example, an Ontario municipality was able to demolish a chimney that was used by chimney swift, but it uncapped and restored another and larger chimney nearby, which then allowed the chimney swift to move to that chimney and provided a better environment for those chimney swift than the one that existed. You hear a lot about implementation challenges. I know you do. I know I do. The Act is unique. It has few comparators, I mentioned earlier. And in many cases, we've had to learn while doing because we can't rely on other jurisdictions to give us their best advice. It also is under very tight legislative timelines that I spoke to about earlier and under high public scrutiny. Adapting to inputs regarding permitting timelines, data quality, policy clarity, socioeconomic analysis, and effective protection recovery have all been keenly considered during these 5 years. But the Act is still very young by comparison to many pieces of legislation that are administered in Ontario who've had decades to figure things out. We are working really hard to make this piece work. What are some of the challenges? Awareness of the Act and its implications. We did a survey in 2010, might be a little dated now, and I'm hoping things are changed next time we do a survey. But it said, the results of that survey said that only 4% of Ontarians knew that there was an Endangered Species Act or that there were really any important issues to be addressed in Ontario with regard to Endangered Species Act. 4%. We have species occurrence information is incomplete. We don't know where they all are, particularly in remote areas across the province. Information and knowledge on species and habitat needs is incomplete, and that creates some acknowledged uncertainty for proponents. The heart of it, it's very difficult to simultaneously address species protection, resource use, and economic development, but we have very many people working at that. Timing issues, as new species get listed, automatic protection, the scientific listing that I spoke to earlier, that can impact projects that are already underway. Many times those projects have been in planning or approval stages and the ESA is the last point. We need to do a better job at figuring out how to harmonize that and to make sure that those things are addressed in the early stages and to think about the timing provisions that exist in the Act to find a better way and a better path forward. It can also be challenging to determine what overall benefit means, especially for new species and in areas with limited available land where habitat is a significant consideration. And proponent timelines are often tight. Permit approvals can take some time, and especially after to reach agreement in principle. So there's a lot of back and forth. So you might hear that it takes 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, 14 months for permits to be issued. A good chunk of that is about dialogue with proponents, back and forth to determine what is it the activity that you're actually doing? What are you trying to do? Can you avoid it? Are there some things that you can do to avoid needing this permit? And if you can't, then it's about a dialogue around those permissions and what are the conditions that we put into the permits. In many cases, we figured out what those conditions are. And we think, using butternut as an example, if you're going to take one tree out, it's a certain size, you might need to plant 10 more. Those are and you might need to manage them. But you know, there are many species where you can establish standard conditions and streamline things. But those aren't things that could have happened in the first year, in the second year, and in some cases in the third year as new species get listed. A picture of things to come. I've got two images here. The first is species occurrence right now, based on where we know. This is only a picture of what we know, where species occur in Ontario. And what you see beside it is June 2013. You heard a lot about these transition species. There were 80 some odd species on the transition list, and 65 of those will now receive habitat protection in June 2013. So this map, the second map, is an overlay onto the first map in terms of occurrences. So seeking solutions, past, present, and future collaboration is at the heart of what we're all here for and what M&R is here to do. We don't have all the answers. No one has all the answers. But to date, we've developed a number of policies, products, and changes to the ESA implementation to find solutions. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of some of those. First one is providing clarity. For the first few years of implementation, many people, proponents, and the general public believe that if the habitat was protected, that whatever was defined was a no-go zone. So what you'll see is generally a habitat categorization policy that was developed. And in this scenario, what you would have understood is determining the challenge of and recognizing that the contraventions of the Act are about damage and destroying its habitat. It's not about creating no zones. So what was the solution? We had a team of policy staff working really hard to categorize and providing clear enunciation of the factors that M&R will be looking at when assessing damage or destroy. So what it does, it provides an added layer of certainty, but it also provides clarity around what the most important features are within that area of habitat. So what you'll see there, an egg-laying zone, which is identified as a little red marker, is the highest area, highly sensitive. You have orange areas, which are moderately sensitive habitat, and the yellow areas are highly tolerable within that habitat. So when you're looking at authorizations that need to occur within those habitat, you need to consider those different degrees of sensitivities. So what's in the red dot may not be able to proceed at all, but what's in the yellow could likely proceed with a little bit of advice, not even require a permit. Provided much clarity on that front. Again, providing certainty. The permitting process, yes, takes time. And the challenge for us was lack of clear, defined processes for what constituted a Section 17.2C, or our overall benefit permit. And that lengthened development and approval timelines for proponents. There's also some variability in applications of process throughout the province, but we've been working really hard on that. Developed a submission standards policy and overall benefit, developed a 3-month service guarantee for the issuance of permits from the time that those solutions have all been agreed to, and we've simplified and significantly streamlined the process with clear enunciation of expectations for proponents and approval times. That builds in some certainty for proponents. There are some unintended consequences, and I think they were recognized by the previous speaker, notably bobolink and other grassland species like the meadowlark. They occur often in areas where there's direct conflict with multiple sectors, and especially agriculture. As a result, the government established the Bobolink Roundtable to find solutions. They're working really hard to find solutions, and they're working really hard to create some innovative solutions to help bridge what might be an invasive solution. But the intent of the ESA, I'd say, was never to create a situation where farmers would stop harvesting hay. We need hay. So solutions need to be found. You'll hear a little bit more about the Bobolink Roundtable over the next couple of days and some of the things that some of their recommendations, which I'm quite excited about. The ESA Panel, a collaborative effort. More recently, an ESA panel, and the minister spoke about it in his opening remarks this morning, was created in November 2012 to give advice to the minister on improvements to the implementation of the Act. It wasn't about changing the Act, it's about what could we do within the confines of the Act, whether it be regulatory approvals, implementation approaches. It included representatives from environmental organizations, members in industry, from forest sector, aggregates, development, water power, and infrastructure in Ontario. They put forward 29 recommendations, which, as the minister noted earlier, are currently being reviewed, and the minister takes quite seriously in terms of recommendations to try and improve some of the areas that we haven't been as good at. We're also working on some non-legislative things to come. When you Google species at risk in Ontario, good news is the M&R Species at Risk website comes up at the top of the list. We spent a lot of time and resources, but as I mentioned earlier, it's a dynamic piece of legislation which requires a lot of updating, a lot of information. We're on the verge of launching, hopefully sometime soon, and hopefully before the summer, a new species at risk website with Google Map support, illustrating species at risk by region and postal code. You can find, if you punch in your postal code, you'll be able to find out which species at risk are in that particular area. Provides natural heritage information, occurrence maps for each species, excluding sensitive species. We know that there are some species that are ripe for the picking, as you might want to call it, so we're quite sensitive to how much information is placed in there and how small a little bit of information can take people to places where we don't want them to be. It's also a one-stop shop for ER postings, consultations, upcoming Caseiro assessments. There's a permit tracker in Google Maps, so if you're in one particular part of the province and you want to know what kind of activities are going on, whether it be an overall benefit permit or otherwise, you'll be able to go in and find out the information about that permit and what's being done to support species at risk. Consistency in icons that speak to, the listing, the recovery strategy, the government response, habitat regulation. So what you'll see there at the bottom is the various stages that highlight our legislative requirements. And if it's lit, it means it's completed with the information to support it. If it's not lit, it means it's not done yet. And it also will provide us with an opportunity to highlight M&R's leading research, like the caribou work that we've been doing. We spent a lot of time interviewing many individuals, so the audience is quite specific, related to the general public, conservation organizations, and proponents that are looking for information. I'm quite proud, and I hope you'll be excited when you see that website launch later this year. Some successes. Since coming into force, the number of species receiving protection has grown nearly fourfold. From 42, as was noted, in June 2008 to 170 today. In June 2013, just a couple of months away, a total of 155 species will be afforded habitat protection. There's no change, there's no plans to change that. Since the ESA came into force, we've issued over 500 permits that have been issued that provide protection to recovery and beneficial actions to species at risk. And since 2007, our Stewardship Fund, which we're very proud of, has supported over 600 community projects with over $28 million that's leveraged at least that amount of investment. So you're talking $60 million leveraged to support species at risk since 2008, and a significant amount of commitments. The projects have helped restore 24,000 hectares of important habitat for species at risk, something that didn't occur before this act was brought in, and contributed over 1,800 seasonal and full-time jobs in support of species at risk. Very proud of this piece of the program. Last piece, the last few slides that I'm going to speak to are really about innovations in stewardship. So the first one is a project we funded just last year to evaluate and monitor habitat utilization, demographics, distribution, and abundance of the Northern Ontario wood turtle population. So in this one, we use members of our M&R canine unit who have been trained to find wood turtles, and they found way more sightings than what conventional survey methods have found. In fact, we were able to increase those sightings by about 40%, something that hasn't been undertaken elsewhere, and Ontario's leading. Another innovation in stewardship. Group received multi-year funding as part of our program to construct a series of groundbreaking eco-passages at Long Point to link two aquatic habitats, a marsh and a bay. This will provide a safe passageway for landing turtles and Fowler's Toad in lieu of having to cross the Long Point Causeway. Real on-the-ground improvements. Innovations in stewardship. Thank our partners at Ontario Nature, who we've helped with some funding on the Ontario Reptile and Amphibian Road Atlas and their data submission tool. This is a smartphone app scheduled to release in 2013. We'll offer photos, range maps, and species descriptions of Ontario at-risk reptiles and amphibians, and it will help engage a more diverse audience to educate on conservation concern of these species, as well as to encourage and promote species occurrence reporting on the landscape. Another success through stewardship, American chestnuts. They've nearly been annihilated by a fungus called chestnut blight, making them scarce on the landscape. An individual, and this is why I'm trying to give a cross-section of organizations, industry, individuals. In this case, we funded an individual to conduct an American chestnut survey across portions of their land in the Golden Horseshoe. An interim report shows the assessment of 58 living trees, 25 of which, almost half, we weren't even aware of. So there's a lot there, and there's a lot of people that are really interested in making this work. Through our stewardship fund and the passion and commitment that we have in staff and in M&R, we're making this work. So that's just a few examples of as I said, the 600 projects that we funded to date. On that, I'd like to close with a few thoughts. You're all here for a variety of reasons. Many of you I want to thank for being part of individuals that were involved in having this act created and updated in the first place. Your passion and your commitment is what got us here. It's the hallmark of those wanting to make the world a better place and Ontario a better place. Reason is our most valuable tool in framing that passion into action that makes sense. And analysis and evidence needs to further refine, verify, and even challenge our reason and passion. All are encouraged to offer insight, respective knowledge, and opinion from this diverse pool of professional and personal backgrounds we have in attendance over the next 2 days. Through your collaboration and the efforts of many parties, we will all continue to seek solutions and show successes on the landscape. Many more in the works, with many more being discussed over the next 2 days. Thanks very much for your time.